Okay, today we're going to be talking about hypothesis, right? This is a very important part of scientific literature. I think this is fundamental. Everybody should know about this. If you're going to be assessing scientific literature, you're going to want to look at the hypothesis. You're going to want to look at the alignment of it in the study itself. This is very, very important, guys. We'll go over the concept of an idea, and then we're going to get right into the hypothesis. You guys are going to love this one for sure. An idea. Science starts with an idea. Of course, the idea must be reasonable, right? Should be logical, should be rational, right? Philosophy, right? This is where philosophy shines. In the idea stage, in the thinking stage. You know, an idea should be able to face philosophical scrutiny before we even try to test and see if it's true, cause and effects and all this, right? It's got to face a philosophical discussion. I think that's very important, right? Any action, anything that happens in the world was a sustained thought before it came to be, right? And that's something that's true in all of life, not just scientific, the method, right? Of course, we have the hypothesis. An important part of scientific method, scientific study, of scientific papers, of science. The hypothesis is very important, right? We draw this from an idea. We draw it from epidemiological studies where we see correlation. We think, okay, let's test this causation. You know, there are many aspects to a good hypothesis, which we'll go over here. Okay, a good hypothesis predicts the relationship between variables, right? This is a fundamental part of a hypothesis, right? You're trying to write an if-then statement. If this, then this is essentially what I'm trying to get at here. So essentially the hypothesis is trying to formulate, I suppose, a sentence that predicts that relationship, right? You know, if a germ is introduced to an individual, then they will become sick. Would be a hypothesis for the germ theory. Falsifiability, of course, fundamental to the hypothesis. Again, it should be a statement that is able to be proven false. You can't have a hypothesis that is not able to be proven false, right? That's the point. You want to try and prove your hypothesis false, and the harder you try to do that, and the more it stands up to that scrutiny, the more true it's going to be. Of course, the hypothesis should be simple and concise. There should be no ambiguity here. It should be very straightforward. There should be no interpretation. There should be no trying to decipher what the hypothesis means, essentially. It should be very, very straightforward and clear, and it should be a clear sentence we mentioned in the introduction. Right? A good hypothesis, of course, should be testable, right? You should be able to conduct an experiment to test if your hypothesis is true or not. It's important to note here that a hypothesis can be tested through experimentation or observation as well, right? Observation is a very key part of science, a lost part of science that was diminished by the Flexner report. If we go back and listen to, in my episode 2 of my podcast, we talk about the Flexner report and how he mentioned that observation is an incomplete way to conduct science, right? Which is totally false in my opinion. Of course, we could have a large debate on this. This is something we'll talk about in the future. I do think observation is complete, especially observation in a purely natural environment, right? And what effect does the conscious observer have on that is another question, maybe leaning towards the quantum realm, but you know, it's regardless, observation is something that we can do, right? We can give somebody a substance and see what happens. We can observe their blood, we can observe their markers. You know, there's ways to go about it, not that I always agree with those, but observation is a foundational part, and you can test the hypothesis through observation. You could test it through experimentation. There are different methods of approaching it. A hypothesis, of course, needs to address the research question, right? If the hypothesis doesn't address the research question, it's an absolutely useless hypothesis, right? It needs to be concise throughout the paper, right? If the research question is, do germs cause disease? And your hypothesis is, if we introduce a germ and then the individual gets sick, you know, that's a good hypothesis for the question at hand, right? But if the question is, do germs cause disease? And we say, if we introduce a culture of bacteria in which the culture contains a plethora of other chemicals, then the individual gets sick. Well, you can't really decipher whether or not that research question was addressed, because that in that culture there's a whole different amount of chemicals there, right? So you're not actually accounting for all the independent variables, which we'll discuss here in a moment. But the obviously they're not going to write the hypothesis in that way either, right? I think I might have set that one up a little bit, but it's that's the case, right? So the hypothesis it needs to align with the research question, it needs to align with the methods, it needs to align, right? There needs to be alignment within a paper, right? This is what doesn't occur, right? When the research question and the hypothesis and the methods section all don't align with each other, right? That's where you're going to have problems, right? Because then the discussion, of course, is going to be all flawed, because they're going to address the research question, with the results from the methods section that makes no sense for the hypothesis or the research question at hand, right? So it all needs to align. And when you're reading scientific papers, there needs to be alignment. That is a foundational aspect, right? Alignment in a paper is something that we don't see very often anymore. Lastly, of course, we have the independent and dependent variables. My biggest problem with the scientific method. We talked about this on Instagram, and I'm going to talk about this a lot more. It's something I'm looking into a lot more. A hypothesis should account for the independent and dependent variables. I suppose I should expand on this a little bit here. Okay, so the independent variable is the part of the hypothesis that you expect to change the dependent variable, right? So let's use the example of the germ that I've been referencing here. The independent variable would be the germ itself. The dependent variable would be the health of the individual, right? Maybe classified by symptoms or presence of a fever or whatever it may be. However you want to define that, right? That's the important, right? It needs to be simple. It needs to be concise. It needs to be detailed. That's something maybe I should have added in there. But essentially, the independent variable is what is changing the dependent variable, right? So you need to account for the independent variable. You should try to isolate the independent variable. That's an important part of a hypothesis, of a scientific experiment, right? You want to isolate the independent variable. There shouldn't be other variables, right? These are called co-founding factors, co-founding variables. And a good scientific study aims at eliminating that, right? So you're actually trying to isolate the independent variable. So that in your study, the independent variable that you introduce is the sole contributing factor to what's changing the dependent variable, right? A good hypothesis obviously is detailed enough to explain this, right? If you're going to introduce a germ to an individual, an isolation of germs, an isolation of bacteria, you give that to an individual, they should have the symptom profile at hand, right? That should be included in the hypothesis. You should describe what the symptom profile should be, right? If you look at Koch's postulates, these are honestly a beautiful set of postulates that are almost a hypothesis in a way, right? This set of postulates absolutely makes a great case for a germ being the cause of a disease, right? If the methods lines up perfectly with the Koch's postulates, that would be absolutely overwhelming proof in my mind that germs are a contributing factor to disease, right? If they are a causal factor to disease. However, this has never been done, obviously, in scientific literature, which is why we don't subscribe to that sort of ideology. But a good hypothesis, of course, you got to account for the independent and the dependent variables, right? You're trying to address these in the hypothesis. You're trying to make them clear, trying to make them detailed enough for the reader to be able to understand it, for it to be clear enough for the purpose of discussion. So, a very important part of the hypothesis. All of this, the hypothesis is really central. I know we spent a lot of time here, but it's really, really central. You really want to understand this. Understanding a good hypothesis. Alignment is everything. Alignment is absolutely everything, right? You want to make sure that you're aligned, that everything in the study is aligned with what you're talking about, with the methods, with the discussion, with the results, with the introduction even. The introduction may be the most useless part. It should give us a good historical background, which I do think is useful in a way, but when you're assessing the study, maybe it's not the most useful part. But the hypothesis is in the introduction, right? So that's the important part to assess and address, right? And just for the purpose of the Blackboard's completion, the hypothesis should be an if-then statement, and it should be aligned with the entire paper, right? You know, this is so important. I cannot stress this enough. If-then statement's important, right? But it's got to include all of this, right? So look at the hypothesis, assess the hypothesis, assess the alignment. That's what I'm going to be hounding on, is the alignment of the hypothesis within the paper itself, within the discussion itself, right? So this is the hypothesis. Okay, I hope you guys enjoyed that detailed explanation of a hypothesis, of hypothesis testing, its integration into studies. That was taken from a larger lecture video that I did. Anyways, I'm going to link that at the end of this video, guys. I hope you guys enjoyed that. Let me know what your thoughts down below, what you would add, what you would remove, what you would contest. You know, I love talking about this stuff. So shoot me a message on Instagram. Links down below. You can support me, buy me a coffee. There's a little link down there. All the proceeds obviously go right back into our revision here, what I'm doing. I'm trying to up the quality, trying to up the you know, trying to up the quality, man. That's what I'm focused on. You know, I want to give you guys the best information possible, invest more of my time into this. I love doing this, guys. So yeah, let me know what you think. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Take care.